Hello and welcome. I am Frank Schumpert, your host, and you are listening to the first ever episode of Empire's podcast, The Ottomans. Introduction to the podcast and the Dream of Osman, Episode 1. This is a podcast explaining the history of the Ottoman Empire, from its foundation in the early 1300s all the way up till 1923, when the Turkish Republic formally abolished the empire. And don't worry if you've never heard of the Ottomans up until now. I hope with this episode to give you a starting point for our journey. My journey into the history of the Ottomans began when I was a freshman undergraduate in college. I had approached my advisor and inquired as to were there any classes on the Ottoman Empire. I recall her laughing and replying, "The Ottomans who?" Cue footstool jokes galore. But then, a sad fact suddenly became apparent to me after our conversation. Here I was, speaking with someone who possessed a PhD in history, who had never heard of the Ottoman Empire. Now don't get me wrong, I know that history is a broad field and all, but still. In a lot of ways, the Ottomans suffered the same fate as the Mongol Empire, and that people have forgotten them, which is really strange when you think about it. Indeed, without the Ottomans, we'd probably, it is fair to say, see a Europe that never would have had the Protestant Reformation, which surely would have been quashed by the Holy Roman Empire, along with Catholic Charles V. Russia, in all likelihood, would be sitting on the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, and in fact, the entire geopolitical makeup of Europe and the Middle East, and I'm looking at you, border between Iraq and Iran, is what it is today because of the forgotten movements of the Ottomans. Like buried fossils, they speak of a long-lost past that impacts our world. As you can imagine, for your North American English-speaking host, the prospect of producing episodes which contain languages as old as Ottoman Turkish come with its own host of challenges, not the least of which is my unmistakable and proud South Carolinian accent. All things being equal, I have decided that I'm going to pronounce the terms, names, and places of the Ottoman Empire as best I can, and in this endeavor I promise I shall fall short. The unavoidable consequence being that my Turkish and Arabic pronunciations will be violated on a criminal level. For this, I'm asking in advance for your patience, understanding, but more importantly, your forgiveness. And if you do possess mastery of the aforesaid languages, and you wish to reach out and offer me respectful criticism, please reach out to me at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also help the podcast by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or a follow and 5-star rating on Spotify. And with this out of the way, let's sit back and go back in time. Somewhere in northwestern Anatolia is what is now modern-day Turkey. There rode a horseman into a village during what historians think may have been the late 13th century. The town in question's name has since been lost, but we do know that the rider was a young man, most likely in his mid to late 20s, and his name was Osman, or as history would dub him, Osman I, accompanied by a band of mounted warriors, who followed him as men of Osman, or as the Byzantines called them, the Ottomans. Osman rode into town, so the story goes, weary from his long ride. The Turkic peoples of whom Osman belonged were long renowned by Arab, Persian, and Mongolian rulers as possessing excellent stamina, and it wasn't unheard of for these Turkish riders to go up to 200 miles a day. Stopping to rest from his journey and seeking shelter for the night, Osman came upon the house of what is described as that of a pious Muslim. Osman was at that time a practitioner of the old steppe people's belief, carried with him all the way from his father's ancestral homeland near Mongolia. Osman was fixing to lay down after settling into the inviting abode of his host, when the pious Muslim man entered the room and laid a book next to him. Osman inquired as to the book and was told by his host, "It is the Quran, the word of God, given to the world through his prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him." Standing all through the night, Osman read the Quran, and it wasn't until the break of dawn he finally settled to sleep. The early mornings, so the adherents of the heterodox dervish mystics believe, was the period favored by God for prophetic visions. Slipping into a dreamlike state, Osman received the word of God from an angel, quote, "Since thou hast read my eternal word with so great respect, thy children and the children of thy children shall be honored from generation to generation," end quote. But this isn't the only telling of Osman's dream. Another popular telling has it that Osman, as a young and up-and-coming chieftain, had aspired for 2 years to win the hand of a certain Turkic maid. Her father, an Islamic qadi or judge, refused his permission for the ceremony, a strong indication that the early Ottomans may have retained their pagan roots. According to legend, as Osman lay asleep, he observed the qadi's daughter laying next to him, and a moon was rising up out of her chest. The moon ascended above the men, but dipped down to Osman's chest. From his loins sprang a small sapling, but this tree grew quickly, thick branches and green leaves. It came forth to cover the world, as its branches embraced the great mountain ranges of the Caucasus, Atlas, Taurus, and Balkans. Even the rivers Nile and Danube, valleys filled with gold-crowned cities, all surmounted by the crescent. In the dream a wind blew the leaves in the tree, and they became sharpened swords, all pointed to the great city of Constantinople. If you were an Ottoman official explaining either of these dreams to a Venetian or British diplomat in the 18th century, the interpretation couldn't have been plainer. The angel's visit to Osman clearly represented divine blessing and sovereignty upon the house of Osman and, by extension, the Ottoman Empire. The moon represented the Muslim faith rising up and banishing the shamanistic traditions within Osman and his followers. The crescent represented both the ascendancy of Islam and the inheritance from the Greeks. It is worth noting here that the crescent and star were traditionally Greek or Byzantine symbols, and not originally Islamic. The sword, pointing at Constantinople, represented the Ottomans' manifest destiny, if you will, to swallow up what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire. Every nation needs an origin story, and the Ottomans were no different. The Russian Empire of old had their story of Rurik, being asked by the Varangians to govern over them in the 9th century. Even in our own times, a quick glance at American history, you're sure to find spider webs of myths and legends that in some way serve the dual purpose of answering 2 perennial questions of empire. Who are we, and what right do we have to govern not only ourselves, but other peoples not like us? Before we fly straight into the great tempest that was the political and military world of Osman I, it is necessary to take a slight vector above the storms and view the chaos from on high. First, who exactly were what history would call the Turkic or Turkoman peoples? Where exactly did they come from in the first place? How did they get from China to Europe? To understand the Turks, and indeed any segment from Eastern history, A brief description of what is known as the Eurasian steppe is in order. If you were to pull out a map that covers Europe all the way to China, what you'd see when describing the Eurasian steppe would be a vast tract of mostly flat grasslands that stretch on for hundreds and in some places thousands of miles. From Romania through Ukraine, southern Russia, all through Central Asia, up to China and swallowing up Mongolia, and it touches the Pacific Ocean. Composed of grasslands and savannas, the agricultural civilizations found the area not so suitable for farming and seldom ventured into it, save for a few excursions by Alexander the Great and later the Romans. Whereas the civilizations of China, Persia, Greece, India, and later Rome were more or less settled agricultural regions, the steppe remained a wild land, untamed by prince or emperor, and populated by wild horsemen who worshipped demons according to their enemies. The Turks then, born of the steppe, were shaped by the extremes of their environment. They were excellent horsemen and had the ability to fire arrows on horseback while riding at full speed. Suffice it to say that the Turks then originated from the steppe, close to modern-day Mongolia. They were proficient on horseback, which made their entire society effectively a mobile cavalry unit with unique archery skills, not equaled by their settled neighbors. Chinese court historians record them simply as the Tuku or Durko peoples. The Turkish peoples were not a single entity, but rather they were a collection of different tribes, but all shared a common cultural and ethnic identity. Sometime between 550 and 780 in the Common Era, Turkish tribes began a process of migrations, following the Eurasian steppe, pastoral plains, and seasonal grassland cycles, from outer Mongolia and into Central Asia. A specific tribe, that of the Akus, according to later Ottoman mythmakers, followed a gray wolf which eventually led them to the city of Samarkand, located in the modern-day country of Uzbekistan. Among the Aguz tribe were a specific subclan called the Seljuk. Arriving in Samarkand in the early 700s, the Seljuks found the city to be the center of the Turkic Khanate, which stretched from the Volga River all the way back to China. This Turkic Khanate was itself established by waves of earlier nomadic Turkish tribes migrating away from the Mongolian steppe. Between 709 and 715, the Turkic Khanate was destroyed by invasions of Arab armies, carrying with them a new faith, that of Islam. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khorazm, the great centers of the Khanate, were all conquered and destroyed. Going back to the Seljuks, the Arab conquerors were quick to appreciate the martial quality of these horsemen and their disciplined fighting units. The Abbasid Caliphate was the first recorded Muslim entity to employ the Turks as mercenaries and slaves. We should point out that slavery in this sense wasn't exactly analogous to the slavery that comes to mind when one thinks of the debased practice in the old antebellum South. It would be more accurate to think of the Turkish, and I'm using air quotes here as slaves or servants, permanently bound to their master by honor and fealty, special privileges, and high pay. Indeed, their status as slaves wasn't so much meant to keep the Arab boot firmly on the back of the Turks, so much as to create a class distinction between the ruler and the warriors. While most steppe peoples, such as the Scythians, the Huns, the Mongols, seem to have let slip their martial edge within a generation, the Turks maintained vigor, skill on horseback, and archery. Even up till the time of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in 1560, the Persian Shah was recorded as being in awe of a troop of Turkish cavalrymen under the Sultan's exiled son Bayezid, as they demonstrated archery while on horseback. This martial skill would set the Ottomans apart in the early 14th century, and when the Byzantine emperors weren't fighting off Ottoman raids into their territory, they aggressively recruited Ottoman contingents to fight as mercenaries in their army. An arrangement that would serve the Byzantines not quite so well as it had worked out for the Arabs. The Seljuk, then later the Ottomans, would prove not only able to retain their skill, but prove themselves capable of emulating their conquerors' best state-building qualities. The establishment of permanent institutions to safeguard the training of the young for military vigor, the assimilation of the written word, along with the great oral traditions from the steppe, fused into what was to become the tools of empire. Eventually, the great Seljuk Turkic Emirates arose, later to become an empire, till at last they were finally knocking on the door of Anatolia. Anatolia had, for centuries, been under the control of the Byzantine Empire. What had for the Byzantines been, for the better part of 200 years, a more or less stable frontier, was suddenly ratcheted by invasions of Arab Muslim, then Persian Muslim invaders. In the year 1071, Seljuk Turkic forces clashed with the military of the Byzantine Empire at what is known as the Battle of Manizkert. Enraged at the blatant incursions of Seljuk raids into Byzantine territory, the Emperor Romanus IV went to war against the Turks with an army composed largely of mercenaries, most of whom, as fortune would have it, were Turkish mercenaries themselves. Upon sighting their Seljuk Turkish cousins, the Byzantine emperor watched on as horror as the Turkish troops under his command promptly switched sides. The Byzantine general Dukas, realizing the cause was now hopelessly lost, retreated with his personal troops and left his emperor exposed. The Byzantine armor was systematically destroyed, and the emperor Romanus captured. The effect of the Battle of Manizkert had upon the history of the Byzantine Empire cannot be overstated enough. In less than a day, the already struggling empire had lost its core of professional soldiery, most of the upper crust of the imperial court, and ended the Byzantines' ability to project power into Anatolia. To this day, historians will point to the battle as a definitive moment the Turkish peoples entered the European awareness. After the defeat at Manizkert, the mortally wounded Byzantine Empire made attempts to rally after the defeat and issued calls to the various courts of Western Europe begging for military aid. These appeals for military aid against the infidel Turk would climax with the First Crusade some years later. The Seljuks eventually fell into conflict with the Mongols, and, being defeated by them, ceded territory to the Mongol Khans. The Mongols broke up the Seljuk Empire into small Turkic political entities known as beyliks. It wasn't until the 1320s, when Osman I minted coins in his own name, thereby signaling to everyone that the Ottomans were declaring independence from the Mongol Khans. Fast forward to the late 1280s after the Battle of Manizkert, and I can finally introduce the Ottomans proper, or, at the very least, their beginnings. Thus we have the foundation legend of the House of Osman, who would become the sultans of the Ottoman Empire. The story goes, with the prerequisite embellishments added during the mid-15th and 16th centuries, that a tribal chieftain by the name of Ertugrul, along with 400 warriors, chanced upon two groups of soldiers duking it out. Deciding to take up the cause of the losing side out of a sense of honor, Ertugrul turned the tables and allowed the erstwhile losers to carry the day. And it was a good thing, too, because the side he chose were the troops belonging to the Seljuk Sultan of Konya, the latest manifestation of Seljuk power that was attempting a re-emergence. Ever grateful to his Turkish kin, the Sultan awarded Ertugrul a beylik. Whether true story or not, a people that became known as the Ottomans were centered around the House of Osman, and they went to the region of Eskishir. This was a fortuitous location, as they were easily within striking distance of the waning Byzantine Empire. Ertugrul and his bands are believed to have raided and invaded strips of land that remained to the Byzantines until the time of his son Osman. Aside from the legends arising from the 15th and 16th centuries, little seems to be known about the historic figure of Osman I, the founder of the Imperial Ottoman dynasty. Upon inheriting the lands of his father, Osman would have found himself compelled to provide for his warriors the opportunities to earn pay, or even better, lead them on raids for plunder. One particular raid into Byzantine territory struck deep into the province of Bithynia, located in the upper northwest coastal area of modern-day Turkey, where Osman's forces laid siege against the city of Nicaea. This proved egregious enough that the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus II was finally forced to deal with Osman. Recorded by Byzantine chroniclers as being the, quote, men of Osman, and later called the Ottomans, the two sides joined a pitched battle in 1301. Emperor Andronicus raised an army of some 4,000 men, and then he promptly passed off the army to a general. However, as with most Byzantine military forces of these time, this was a motley sort. Between 1,500 and 2,000 were foot soldiers conscripted from the European side of the empire. Add to that a force of about 2,000 Alan mercenaries, the Byzantines faced off against a united force of Ottomans, numbering some 5,000 horsemen. The two sides met near a place called Bapheus in Byzantine territory. Ever hear of the old adage, never trust mercenaries? Well, the Battle of Bapheus is proof in point why we don't trust mercenaries all that well. The Alan mercenaries, upon sighting the Turkish horde before them, prudently decided not to join battle, reasoning it was better for their health if they quietly slinked off back across the Bosporus and to the European side. The Turkish army fell upon the remaining Byzantines and slaughtered them to a man. The victory at Bapheus was the first recorded great victory of the Ottomans. They had successfully repulsed an organized attempt by the Byzantine Empire to repel them from the strategically important province of Bithynia, and opened the way to future conquests into the European side of the Byzantine Empire. The Greek emperor left only small, poorly supplied, and mostly unpaid garrisons to defend what was left of his Bithynia holdings, and one by one, the towns, villages, and fortresses fell into Ottoman hands. Nicomedia itself fell to the Ottomans in 1337, sealing the fate of Anatolia, as far as the Byzantines were concerned, forever. Well, this wraps up the first episode ever of Empire's Podcast, The Ottomans. For those of you new, I hope that you'll stick around, and we'll explore what happens to Osman as he expands the Ottomans into Europe. Thank you.